For the sixth year, the Alliance of Democracies has teamed up with Latana to do polling about attitudes towards democracy across the world. Latana spoke to people in 53 countries, representing 75% of the world's population, asking individuals how they felt about democracy in their own countries. You can find the full results online and on the app. But here to provide highlights to us is Nico Jaspers. He is the CEO of Latana. Nico, great to have you back.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So the focus of today, as Anders has told us, is Russian aggression to Ukraine. We also are going to be talking a lot about Taiwan. What did you discover about attitudes towards those two subjects in your polling?
We asked, of course, lots of questions on the topic of Ukraine and the war there. I want to highlight two interesting findings that we've seen. The first one concerns the support of the world for the role of the EU, US, and NATO for Ukraine. And this is quite impressive. You have almost a third of the people around the world, not just in the US or the EU, saying that NATO, the EU, and the US have not done enough, and then you have another 48% who say they've done about the right amount, and only a very small number of people who say there has been too much support for Ukraine here. The interesting thing here is that these numbers are pretty even across all the countries that we polled, which represent 3/4 of the world's population. Even in China, which is on your far right, you have more than half the people saying that NATO, the US, and the EU have done either too little or about the right amount, which I find really interesting. The next question is, we asked people whether they are against or for cutting economic ties with Russia. And here you have some interesting results. Even after a year of sanctions, you still have very strong support for cutting economic ties with Russia. It's one thing to say this in the abstract when you don't feel the pain, which I'm German, which some people in Germany have. And then after a year to still have this strong support. And then you have countries like South Africa. These are the populations, not their leaders. Brazil, Argentina, and even India being more, on the fence, and then some countries, of course, against cutting ties. You asked about Taiwan. We asked the same question on Taiwan. So if China were to invade Taiwan, how many countries, the people in those countries would favor cutting ties with China? And the answer here was quite interesting, because there are more countries than even in favor of cutting ties with Russia who would be in favor of cutting ties with China, most notably some Latin American countries, and then India and Iran, and then, of course, countries that are not in favor of cutting ties, most notably maybe Russia.
Did you ask questions about social media and democracy, another topic we'll be discussing over the next year and a half?
This was also a big topic in the past years, and we asked several questions here again, mostly on the role that people see of social media having, the impact that social media has on democracy, whether they say it has a positive or negative impact. Quite interesting here. Overall, in democracies, you still have the majority of people saying social media has a positive impact on democracy, but there's a very interesting split when you drill it down to individual regions, where you see that countries in the global south, in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the MENA region are overwhelmingly see a positive impact of social media on democracy, whereas if you go to Europe or the US, people are much more critical, with an even split in the US. Just as many people say it has a negative impact on democracy as who say that it has a positive one.
What did you find about overall threats to democracy worldwide?
Well, let me start with the state of democracy. We also asked about threats, but one of the really uplifting things here, this is a question that this is the 6th edition, so we've been asking this question 6 years, how important people feel is democracy in their country. And it's quite remarkable. We have a record high this year of people who say democracy is really important to have in their country. 84% of the people around the world say democracy is really important to have, and this, you see this in every country around the world that we polled. There are some differences when you break it down to some components of democracy. So there are differences on, for example, freedom of speech. We have other things like rule of law. You can all find this in the report. There are some differences in how important people think different components are, but overall support for democracy around the world has never been higher. On the threats, Jeanne, this is something that we've measured consistently, and this is something that we should, I think, pay much more attention to when we ask people what is the single most important threat to democracy around the world. People have, year after year, cited economic inequality and corruption as the two biggest threats to democracy in their own countries. People don't take a global view, they usually see in my country what is the biggest threat, and economic inequality and corruption are consistently the biggest threats, followed by the impact of global corporations and limits of freedom of speech, foreign election interference, and other factors. We always get asked about the US. It's an important country, of course, in this debate, so we did a little drill down on the US. Well, depends on how you see it. The good news is that this is some of the historical numbers. They're still very solid support. Americans still have faith in democracy, which is good. If you compare this to the global average, it's slightly below the global average. So there are about a quarter of the population who consistently says, well, it's not that important. So this should maybe also give us some pause for thought. When we look at the question of what people in the US see as the biggest threats to democracy, it's similar to what people around the world see as threats to democracy, but there's one very interesting dynamic that has happened. So this lists what people see as the biggest risks. You have economic inequality up there among the top two, big tech, much bigger than in other countries. But here's what's interesting. Across all these metrics, it has grown tremendously over the past few years, how people perceive threats to democracy. So there's a general sentiment in the US, that's our reading of this, that their democracy is, let's say, more under threat than it has historically been, not by just one single factor, but by a range of factors. Something very interesting to think about. Let me close with one slide on the perception of key actors on the global stage. We always ask that question to see how that changes over time and where important institutions and countries are. As a proud European, it's always good to see Europe up there. Hugely positive perception of Europe around the world. And in the report, you see a breakdown of all the countries, how they see Europe, positive and negative perception. An overwhelmingly positive perception of the EU. Very similar results for the United Nations. The US, also very similar, with a bit more people seeing it negative. Then a complete split of the attitudes towards China, which is very interesting. And then perhaps not surprisingly, Russia towards the bottom with a large net negative perception.
Always fascinating results. Let me remind you, you can find the full results in your app and also online. Thank you, Nico Jaspers, CEO of Latana. Appreciate it.